Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for Naturalist 101. We're extra excited this evening because we actually have a person on our board present. Jim Barger is going to be presenting about the book he wrote. And of course, I left it in the back of the room. Thank you. Jimmy Carter, Rivers and Dreams. So we're really excited that he's going to talk here. But we also, before we bring him up, I want to thank all of our members that are here for supporting programs like this that we can offer them for free. And we also want to thank our sponsors. We have a whole list of sponsors that have been going behind me in the back. But most importantly, what I just left, but most importantly, we want to thank our friends at Southwire for really helping us do all this different programming and getting to learn more about our Georgia coast. So without further ado, Judith, yours.
Yeah. Thank you. And this thing is on? No, I don't need a chair. Does this work? Can you all hear me?
Well,
okay.
That only works
for these folks. Okay. It's a lot of technology. I'm really thankful to be here. I've been in Atlanta all week talking to people up there about this book and about Jimmy Carter's record. I'm so glad to be home with my real people down here. And I've picked out 3 different selections to talk to you about. And they have intersections with our coast, and talk about Jimmy Carter's love for the coast. I'll just let you know that many of you know this was a special place to him. He came here and he selected his cabinet, met here after he was elected, but before he was inaugurated. And that's when I met him, when I was just a little boy, 5 years old, I guess, when he was elected. But I'm going to start with a story about after he was elected, and how he started to think about what he might do with the rest of his life. So if you'll bear with me, I've got these 3 readings, and then we'll have some questions if you want to. Fishing is a completely anonymous pursuit. Maybe that's one of the things that makes it so attractive to those of us who become anglers. In the final estimation, it is always just you and the fish. And the fish has no preconceived notion of you. The fish neither knows nor cares anything about you. If you fail to catch the fish, it is always because you failed to make an offering enticing enough to persuade it. If you succeed in catching a fish, it is for the most part through no particular merit of your own. Knowledge, skill, study, determination, humility, and experience all play key roles in determining whether a fish will strike and whether you can thereafter land the fish before it throws the hook or breaks the line. But just as often, success is a fluke caused by a mistake or miscalculation, by a creature not far evolved from the time before time, when the earth was formless and desolate, and the raging ocean that covered everything was engulfed in total darkness, and the Spirit of God moved over the water. To catch a fish is to experience grace in its most indiscriminate form. A fish doesn't know or care who you are, or who you know, or what you believe in, or don't believe in, or what you look like, or where you come from, or what you're going through, or what you have done, or what you have left undone. A fish doesn't know or care if you are rich or poor or sinner or saint, or even if you once were the President of the United States of America. In May of 1981, less than 4 months after vacating the White House, Jimmy, Rosalind, and their 13-year-old daughter, Amy, packed up a camper van and set out on a 900-mile road trip up from their home in southwest Georgia to their friend Wayne Harpster's farm in western Pennsylvania. No longer the President and First Lady, they were private citizens setting out on an otherwise fairly typical American vacation with their teenage daughter. It was Wayne's birthday, and he invited the whole Carter family to celebrate with him and spend a week trout fishing. The Carters' 3 adult sons, Jack, Chip, and Jeff, all planned to bring their families and meet there. Rosalind and Jimmy looked forward to having their whole family together again in one place and to letting their minds focus on nothing but reading the river for trout and casting a fly line. The biggest worry they faced while there was what to cook for dinner and whose turn it was to clean up after. The preceding months had been among the darkest in their lives. Watching from the sidelines as their political opponents promised to roll back many of the Carters' hard-won achievements. The American people had soundly rejected President Carter, and the re-election loss stung him hard. At home in Plains, he grew despondent and spent most of his time in his woodworking shed trying to distract himself by making furniture for the family home. Woodworking had become one of the few things that brought him any joy. But as the camper van wound its way up the Blue Ridge Parkway and down through the Shenandoah Valley, Jimmy Carter marveled at the natural beauty of the American countryside. Once they got to Spruce Creek, the pastoral setting and cool waters renewed him, especially the time he finally got to spend alone with Rosalind. She'd smile and birds would feel that they no longer had to sing, he once wrote in a poem about her. I loved to watch Rosalind fishing, Carter later recalled about that week in 1981 on Spruce Creek. She had a knack for the sport and liked it, especially the solitude and beauty of the woodlands. When they weren't fishing, Rosalind and Jimmy went on hikes together, holding hands, wandering up across the cattle pasture and back into the woods across the creek from the Harpsters' fishing cottage. Instead of lamenting the things they'd been forced to leave unfinished, they began to discuss all the things they might accomplish outside the confines of the White House. The presidency had given them great power, but was also highly restrictive. Whether it was Congress, the press, foreign leaders, agitators, political opponents, or even his own party cabinet aides and supporters, everything the Carters did over the prior 4 years had been subject to some form of scrutiny or compromise. They had accomplished much while in the White House, more in fact than any other president before or since on certain issues like land conservation and peace accords. And yet, everything Jimmy Carter achieved while in office for his country and the world had required great political self-sacrifice and would only be fully appreciated by future generations. But now the Carters were free to chart their own path. As they wandered up the hillside into dense woods, the seed of an idea slowly began to germinate. Maybe there was a way they could use their positions as former President and First Lady of the United States to promote human rights and democracy around the world, helping America fulfill her promise of liberty and justice for all people everywhere. Emerging from the shadows of the forest, Rosalind and Jimmy climbed a steep slope to an outcrop high above Spruce Creek. A bluebird called from somewhere back in the twisted laurels. When they reached the top, the wooded canopy opened in front of them, and they could see out over the entire valley. Exhausted from the climb, they sat on the ground to rest. Rosalind reached over and took Jimmy's hand. Mountain laurel and rhododendrons bloomed pink and white all around. The sweet scent of flowers hung heavy in the air. A fresh wind swept over them. The bluebird flitted out of the forest onto a nearby branch. Holding hands, the Carters looked across the green pastures as far as their eyes could carry them. And we all know that after that, the Carters went on to just systematically find problems that needed solutions and could be solved, and they did it. Together, they built 4,000 houses with their own hands, not to mention all the others that they were a part of through Habitat for Humanity. President Carter was in his late 90s when he built his last house. He fell, cut his head, had to have stitches, was back there the next day. In fact, he was back there the next day fussing at Garth Brooks for sitting around and not working as hard as he needs to. when they went to Africa and they learned about guinea worm, a disease that was affecting millions of people, a worm that infects the body through the unclean water, and this worm can grow to be 3-4 feet inside the body before it burrows its way out. It's one of the most painful ways to become infected and die. Millions of people were infected with guinea worm. President Carter learned about it. Rosalind Carter learned about it, and they were told it was preventable. The last time I visited with him in their home, it was about a year and a half before he passed away, and the number was down to 4, and he was watching it every day. So we know what they did afterwards. I want to take you back, though, to remember and think about some of the things that they did that we're still benefiting from and the environment is benefiting from when he was president. And they happen to be some of the very things that are being targeted today to be unrolled. The book, he had several friends, and they went on trips together. They went back to Spruce Creek, the place I just read to you about, every year in May. My family and I have been up there. It's a beautiful place. And on those trips, they would also decide, well, let's go somewhere else too. And so there were a lot of exotic trips. And this book takes you through all of those exotic trips. One of which that I'm going to read to you now is about their time in Venezuela. They had the 2 trips to Venezuela where, and during those trips, President Carter was also trying to broker an economic peace and solution between Hugo Chavez and the capitalist factions in the country. But I have also been to these same areas, and this is my account of my time in the Amazon and how it relates to our home. So, our camp was a cluster of canvas wall tents erected on aluminum pontoons, anchored alongside an isolated sandbar. The barre guides who hosted us towed the floating fish camp to a new site each week during the season so that anglers who visited would have the opportunity to explore and fish nearby waters that had never been fished before. In the evenings, we dined by firelight on fresh fried peacock bass we'd caught earlier in the day. As in many places I've visited over the years, the adventure fishing industry offered the local people an income in harmony with their traditional and preferred way of life. Their operation stood in stark contrast to the illegal deforestation by outside business interests that continues to threaten the entire Amazon River basin, an area that accounts for some 40% of the entire continent. Roughly the size of Australia, the Amazonian rainforest is responsible for producing approximately 20% of the Earth's oxygen and storing some 120 billion tons of carbon. Life as we know it depends on the preservation of this one ecosystem, and yet it's vanishing at an alarming pace. During 2020 alone, when industry otherwise slowed globally due to the COVID-19 pandemic, Brazil lost an area of Amazonian rainforest roughly the size of the state of Connecticut due to deforestation. Mining, agricultural expansion, and related fires south of the Orinoco River in Venezuela have consumed hundreds of thousands of acres of rainforest in that section of Amazonia since President Carter, Dr. Hicks, and their fishing buddies first visited there. It's maddening to know that there yet remain people who steadfastly refuse to believe in the problem of climate change, who refuse to believe the earth is warming at an alarmingly dangerous rate, and who refuse to believe that human activities such as deforestation and the burning of fossil fuels is causing the polar ice caps to melt, sea levels to rise, and the mass extinction of varied and diverse species with whom we share the planet. We are all part of the problem, but unfortunately, we are not all part of looking for a solution. According to the most recent scientific estimates, as much as 1/4 of the Earth's flora and fauna will likely become extinct by 2050 if climate change continues at the current rate unabated. In his book, Half Earth, world-renowned scientist E.O. Wilson proposed an answer that is brilliant in its simplicity. Set aside half of the planet as a nature reserve. As Wilson pragmatically pointed out, logging and mining in remote areas like the Amazonian rainforest, operate on an incredibly thin margin. Accordingly, conservation can be an economically viable alternative to deforestation and development, particularly in the most wild and remote areas of the Earth, which also happen to be the most worthy of protection. By purchasing land outright or by purchasing logging, mining, and developing rights in wilderness areas, conservation organizations like the Nature Conservancy and Conservation International, together with local and regional land trusts, with the buy-in from resident populations, which is a big part of what 100 miles fills that gap, can outbid industrial exploiters and protect natural areas permanently. I have seen the real-world effects of this conservation strategy espoused by E.O. Wilson firsthand, just outside my window in my own backyard. From my writing desk, I can see the Hampton River wash into the Atlantic Ocean as one of the several distributaries of the mighty Altamaha River. Long nicknamed Georgia's Little Amazon. The Altamaha is the largest free-flowing river system on the East Coast and is a watershed of global significance. Over 120 species of rare and endangered plant and animal species rely upon it, including 7 species of mussels found nowhere else in the world. Upriver in its freshwater sections, it provides a crucial spawning area for 2 endangered species of giant sturgeon. Downriver, in its saltwater sections, it is a primary calving area for the critically endangered North Atlantic right whale, whose numbers are down to less than 350. I get choked up thinking about that. And whose annual deaths currently outpace births. I found a right whale when I was in the 6th grade that beached on the north end of St. Simon's beach there. And my nephew found one beached there as well when he was about the same age. The sandbars, beaches, freshwater wetlands, and salt marshes found throughout the Altamaha watershed offer vitally important nesting grounds and migratory havens for dozens of species of shorebirds and wading birds. In fact, some of the very same migratory birds the Carters and I saw during our respective trips to Amazonia might very well have spent time in the marshes outside my window during their biannual migration. One of the 3 largest water basins on the entire Atlantic seaboard, the Altamaha pours over 100,000 gallons of water into the ocean per second, feeding one of the ocean's largest nurseries for numerous species of sharks. It's also home to the oldest stand of trees on the east coast of North America. The ancient stand of bald cypress growing in the Altamaha River swamps of Lewis Island began growing around the time of the Islamic prophet Muhammad. But by the early 1970s, over 1,000 years later, this last remaining virgin stand of old-growth cypress was set to go to the sawmill until Jimmy Carter intervened. Together with Georgia environmentalist Jane Yarn, then Governor Carter established the Georgia Heritage Trust in 1972 to purchase Lewis Island for the state, protecting the trees in perpetuity. Has anybody in here ever gone to see those trees? You really need to do it. Maybe these 2 can get together and put it. Birch, you've taken some people in there.
We talked about it, but you have to hit it right with the rain level.
Yeah, you got to wade in there or you've got to come in by boat. But it's intense. I mean, all of us could try to get around some of those trees. I highly recommend it. All right, let me find where I was. I digress. Yarn, who later would become the head of President Carter's White House Council on Environmental Quality, set in motion the protection of the entire Altamaha when she and her family donated Egg Island and worked to raise the money to also acquire nearby Little Egg and Wolf Islands, which together now form a more than 5,000-acre national wildlife refuge at the mouth of the Altamaha. The most remarkable part of that story is that Jane Yarn got involved. When Jane Yarn got involved, she was just an ordinary citizen, a member of her local garden club, a woman who loved wild spaces and felt compelled to protect them. She wasn't a career environmentalist or a wealthy benefactor or a politician with an agenda. She and her husband mortgaged their home to protect Egg Island. She marshaled an army of garden club women to send letters to the governor to prevent Georgia's barrier islands from becoming exploited by phosphate mining corporations. That's what we do now, right? It's a little more organized. But that was just the beginning. For decades now, a wide variety of interested parties, including family farmers, hunting clubs, fishing clubs, billionaires, environmentalists, timber companies, conservation organizations, land trusts, and various state and federal agencies ranging from the Georgia Department of Natural Resources to the U.S. Department of Transportation, Fish and Wildlife Service, and even the military have cooperated to protect over 250,000 acres of uplands and wetlands along 56 contiguous miles of the lower Altamaha River forever. One of my dear friends and personal heroes, Christy Lambert, Coast and Marine Director for Conservation for the Nature Conservancy, tirelessly worked with a host of friends and colleagues and interested parties on every transaction. She met with hunters gathered around fires at their camps, with farmers out in their fields, with foresters out in the woods, with soldiers on military bases, and with every stakeholder along the Altamaha River to string together purchases, conservation easements, and natural buffer zones. Christy calls what she does landscape quilting. Individually placing covenants on many different patches of land through a variety of conservation tools with the voluntary participation of public, private, and corporate landowners to ultimately blanket an entire geographic area with environmental protections that will benefit everyone in perpetuity. Christy and her colleagues will continue to sew the landscape quilt along the Altamaha, working their way along the upper portions of the river until someday the entire watershed is protected. They have expanded the quilting concept to begin protecting some of Georgia's other vital river systems, like the Satilla and the Ogeechee, and to serve as a model for protecting other threatened ecosystems across the nation and around the world. The cooperative effort to save the Altamaha proves the feasibility of E.O. Wilson's wildly ambitious half-Earth concept. It's not just a pipe dream. It's actually doable if we just muster the collective will to achieve it, bringing diverse interests together toward a common goal to preserve one wild space at a time. Just as the Carters set out to do the unimaginable in fighting to completely eradicate specific infectious diseases like river blindness, we also can set out to do the unimaginable and strive to set aside half of the Earth's lands and waterways in their natural state, if we are willing and committed. Protecting half of the Earth as wild spaces not only will slow the progression of global warming and the mass extinction of species, but also will protect ancient ways of life for indigenous people and shrink the ever-increasing wealth gap around the world. Wilderness areas can then be put to use not by industrial exploitation, but by the development of non-invasive income production, such as low-impact extraction of medicinal products and ecotourism, hiking, kayaking, canoeing, mountain climbing, bird watching, swimming, diving, sustainable hunting, fishing, and foraging. In turn, anglers, hunters, and outdoor enthusiasts, motivated by their experiences in wild spaces, can become vital partners in the conservation effort through a shared desire to interact with nature. All right, I told you I was going to limit it to 3 readings. I've got one more for you. This kind of gives an overview of all of the things that Carter did as governor and as president, but it's set in the backdrop of a place that was particularly important to him, the state of Alaska. Carter sacrificed his political career many times by doing things that were against his political self-interest, and that often Rosalynn counseled him were not wise to do. This one, though, they both agreed was worth it, and that was protecting the Alaskan wilderness. Over 150 million acres Carter set aside for protection. But it was not well received. Jimmy Carter's dogged determination to protect the Alaskan wilderness may very well prove to be his most enduring legacy. Since Dwight D. Eisenhower, every president had struggled to define and implement land use practices in Alaska, balancing the interests of the many varied human stakeholders. Carter's position was comparatively simple. Let nature take its course. Implementing that strategy, however, turned out to be incredibly difficult and contentious. President Carter made safeguarding the Alaskan wilderness a top priority early in his time in office. I paid close attention to this extremely complex issue during my entire term, he reflected in annotations to his diary years later. It provoked intense struggles among the state government, private landowners, Indians, Inuits, hunters, fishermen, timber interests, environmentalists, the oil industry, and their highly paid lobbyists in Washington. The pages of his presidential diary are littered with descriptions of frustrating and ultimately fruitless meetings he conducted in the White House throughout his term, confronting Alaska Senators Ted Stevens and Mike Gravel and others who vehemently opposed Carter's efforts to safeguard Alaska's wild spaces. The two senators were aligned with oil and other commercial interests, and I was determined to set aside large areas for forestry, parks, and wilderness areas, he explained. There was little room for compromise between the two factions. While Jimmy Carter ultimately won the legislative showdown over the fate of Alaska that since has paid unsurpassed dividends for the state and the nation, in the short term, his relentless determination to preserve the Alaskan wilderness proved to be just one more factor that set the political power structure in Washington against him and helped doom his chances for re-election. At the end of his term in 1980, Carter finally succeeded in defying the powerful oil and gas lobby by establishing the Alaska National Interest Land Conservation Act, preserving over 150 million acres of wilderness for posterity. No president before or since has come anywhere close to protecting as much land, more than 30% of our nation's wilderness. The achievement came at a high political cost, and the effort dragged through his entire 4 years of office, drawing passionate responses from otherwise historically disenfranchised supporters, and conversely from extremely powerful detractors who were accustomed to getting their way. Native Americans gathered in droves in the nation's capital to support President Carter's efforts. In a sacred ceremony, the Tlingit tribe welcomed the president as an honorary member into the Raven Beaver clan, renaming him Ha-Hu-Wu, a traditional title describing a chief who protects the natural world. But back in Alaska, angry opponents of the president's conservation efforts, who hoped to profit from untapped Alaskan oil reserves, hung and burned Jimmy Carter in effigy. When President Carter traveled to the Lorraine Motel in Memphis in 1978 to place a wreath at the site where the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated 10 years earlier, Alaska Congressman Don Young retorted that Jimmy Carter's proposed Alaskan lands bill was a violation of his constituents' human rights, comparing it to the oppression that MLK fought in the Jim Crow South. In the summer of 1979, Carter made plans to stop and, quote, see my friends in Alaska on his way to Japan for the G7 summit, to which one advisor dryly quipped, well, that won't take long. The president's visit was greeted by protesters and a chilly reception from Senator Stevens, who claimed that Jimmy Carter had, quote, declared war on Alaska. Senator Gravel didn't show up at all. I presume he only goes back to Alaska on election year, Carter jotted in his diary that day. As Air Force One touched down in Anchorage, one of Jimmy Carter's aides jokingly presented him with a mule driver's whip in case he needed to, quote, whip somebody's ass. The following year, at the State Fair in Fairbanks, people paid to throw bottles at pictures of Jimmy Carter or the Ayatollah Khomeini. The pile of glass shards under Carter's picture at the end of the fair was noticeably higher than Khomeini's. Today, the Alaskan wilderness preserved by Carter is widely considered to be one of our nation's greatest assets, an area of global significance not unlike the Amazon rainforest, providing a baseline ecosystem for wildlife populations, sequestering carbon, and mitigating the ongoing warming of our planet and the mass extinction of species. Jimmy Carter's commitment to preserving the Alaskan wilderness not only demonstrated his long-term strategy for environmental stewardship in that state, but it also was a continuation of his consistent commitment to the preservation of natural spaces throughout his lifetime that can be traced back to his earliest moments in politics. As a young state senator, Jimmy Carter supported the passage of Georgia's Coastal Marshlands Protection Act, a seminal piece of legislation that protects Georgia's 100-mile coastline. He prevented the Flint River from being dammed, ultimately safeguarding the entire watershed from its farthest reaches in North Georgia all the way down to Florida's Apalachicola Basin and the Gulf of Mexico. During his 4 years as governor, Carter vetoed numerous applications to drain Georgia's swamps, protecting one of the state's most vital but unsung natural resources, our freshwater wetlands. His efforts first as governor and later as president safeguarded the Chattahoochee River from its headwaters in the southern Appalachians down to metro Atlanta, where it was in danger from contamination by proposed sewer lines and unchecked urban sprawl. He designated the Chattooga River as a wild and scenic river, safeguarding the river from damming and preventing development along all 57 miles. These weren't just sweeping acts by a remote politician sitting behind a desk either. Jimmy Carter spent countless hours fishing the Chattahoochee, and he and friend Claude Terry were the first people ever to tandem canoe the harrowing white water of Chattooga's Bull Sluice Rapid, Class 4, in a canoe. They should have died. During his 4-year presidency, Carter designated 56 million acres of wilderness for protection under the Antiquities Act. The only president to protect more land in that manner was Teddy Roosevelt, who originally signed the act in 1906. By the way, Carter created Teddy Roosevelt National Park in his honor. Carter's example inspired future presidents George W. Bush and Barack Obama to expand use of the Antiquities Act to the world's oceans, together preserving over 500 million acres of marine habitat. President Carter established our nation's Superfund, which continues to mandate cleanup of hazardous waste sites throughout the country in the ongoing fight for environmental justice, and has saved untold numbers of lives of Americans who otherwise would have been poisoned by toxic contamination. He more than doubled the size of our national park system. In 4 years, he basically created half of our park system. Created 39 new national parks scattered throughout the country and passed the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act to prohibit mining within or adjacent to our national parks. Carter saved California's redwood forest and giant sequoias, national treasures that have stood for thousands of years but were threatened in the 1970s by unbridled adjacent clear-cutting. Jimmy Carter was among the first world leaders to consider the impending threat of climate change. He signed the National Energy Act and established the Department of Energy, the two most critical ongoing initiatives to diversify our nation's energy supply and prioritize alternative fuel sources. He was also a nuclear physicist, by the way. Long before discussions of climate change had become mainstream or were on the agendas of world leaders or even many scientists, President Carter commissioned studies of the issue which produced prescient warnings. One of those reports, created during his first year in office, entitled Release of Fossil CO2 and the Possibility of a Catastrophic Climate Change, caused him grave concern and led to the commissioning of the Global 2000 report to the president. The report predicted the effects on the planet by the year 2000 if climate change went unaddressed, and was intended to be used by Carter and future administrations. 40 years before the United Nations Paris Climate Conference came to the consensus that global temperatures needed to be capped at 2% Celsius, President Carter's Global 2000 report made the same recommendations. Addressing the nation in 1977, Jimmy Carter attempted to lay out both the problem and the solution. We must not be selfish or timid if we hope to have a decent world for our children and our grandchildren, he said. Using exhaustive data and facts, he outlined 10 guiding principles in addressing climate change that balanced economic growth, conservation, environmental protection, and cooperation among government, corporate, and individual interests. He set 7 specific, achievable goals, prioritizing conservation while establishing petroleum reserves and making specific reductions in energy demands, gasoline usage, and oil imports. He set goals for alternative fuel development and usage, calling for improved insulation on new construction of buildings and solar energy usage for over 2 million American homes. We simply must balance our demand for energy with our rapidly shrinking resources, he said. By acting now, we can control our future instead of letting the future control us. No succeeding president referenced the Global 2000 report after Jimmy Carter left office. Although President Obama made significant strides toward addressing climate change, his successor rolled back those efforts and broke the legally binding promises the United States had made to almost 200 other nations that our country would reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Despite pushback and tepid reception for the issue politically, President Carter passed legislation to encourage the research and use of alternative fuels, and even led by example by installing solar panels on the roof of the White House. After the Carters vacated the presidential residence, Ronald Reagan eventually had the solar panels removed, and his chief of staff told the press the panels were just a joke. Criticizing Carter's environmental measures on the campaign trail, Reagan falsely denied the harmful effects of coal, gasoline, and other pollutants, bizarrely claiming that, quote, 80% of nitrogen oxide pollutants in the air come from trees. That's what he said. During his 8-year tenure, Reagan cut funding for alternative energy research by 2/3, and his failure to heed Carter's warnings doomed the country to rely on fossil fuels and remain beholden to oil-rich nations in the Middle East. At the same time, the earth steadily continued to warm and the sea levels continued to rise. President Carter's environmental efforts were part of his lifelong commitment to a world he believed both mysteriously created by a watchful God and also the complex product of billions of years of evolution, shaped by and shaping the humans and other creatures inhabiting it. At 94, Jimmy Carter expounded in his book, Faith, A Journey for All. He wrote 34 books, by the way. On his unique perspective on the interplay between human and natural resource history gleaned from nearly a century of direct observation, intensive scientific study, and critical examination of his personal religious faith informed by his daily search for guidance and wisdom in the Christian Bible. This is what he said. We know that evolution is a global process, usually progressive, that results from the adaptation of living organisms to natural selection and sudden mutations. I believe it has been God's plan to evolve human beings, and that after thousands of centuries, we now find ourselves uniquely endowed with an understanding of who and what we are, and have the knowledge and freedom to help shape our own destiny. President Carter anguished over our abuse of the planet, yet with his signature optimism tempered by realism, he maintained hope and faith in its resilient potential. I am confident that the earth itself will remain basically the same, continuing to shape the lives of its owners for good or ill, as it has for millennia, he wrote in An Hour Before Daylight. Jimmy Carter's unparalleled environmental legacy has stood firm for more than half a century, helping safeguard the earth for future generations despite relentless attacks by politicians and profiteers who would treat the earth as a temporary commodity for immediate gain. So I got one little coda to the rest of the story, as they say, on this, and then I'll open it up for questions. So at the age of 92, Jimmy Carter and Rosalind Carter traveled to Alaska with a group of friends to celebrate their 71st wedding anniversary. They fished there. He was a relentless fisherman, and she was too. At that age, they still waded out into the streams, fought the current against their waders. They would never let anyone else touch their fishing rod or release their fish. And on that trip, he landed a 26-inch rainbow trout. He was, as I said, 92 years old. And that wasn't his last trip. His last trip was at 95 to the Yucatan, which is also in the book. But they had a great trip. He got to see and stand in the waters that he had helped preserve. But I want to read you 3 paragraphs, and I promise we won't go much longer. Our friend Janice Ray does that. She tells you exactly how long and whenever she's going to read a section. But I think you'll want to hear this because I don't want to end on a sad note. All those years later, on their way home from the Copper River, their little group was just tired and wanting to peacefully enjoy some pizza and a cold beer and go to bed. They had left and flown in. They were going to fly out commercially, and they were in a little town. The last thing they wanted was to draw attention. Looking around the room of the restaurant, Rosalind said, "Most of the people in here probably weren't even born when we passed the Alaska Lands Bill. I wonder if they have any idea what Jimmy sacrificed for them." The president just kept eating his pizza. Suddenly, a few people stood up and looked over at our table. They started clapping. Then a few more stood up and started clapping. More people stood until everyone in the room was on their feet clapping, whistling, and cheering during an impromptu standing ovation for Jimmy Carter that lasted several minutes. So he had to wait more than 30, 40 years to finally get affirmation, but it was worth it. I'll open it up to questions. There's one.
I know he used to go trout fishing up in Georgia, I want to say LJ, where he had his house.
He shared a cabin with some friends in LJ. Yep.
Because our parents' best friends lived next door to him.
Oh, wow.
So when we went to visit, this was the last driveway before security, and they said they would see him down in the stream all the time.
That's great. Yeah, he loved to fish, and they built that cabin.
Oh,
Yeah. It's pretty cool. They had it for many years.
They don't have it
No, well, they sold it. It's been quite a number of years before they sold it, and they lived in the same house in Plains forever. It's just like the house I grew up in. It's a 3-bedroom ranch style house, and he built most of the furniture in it. And now, after all those years of building the parks, he and Rosalind gave that house to us, and it's going to be a park. His house that he grew up in Archery is already a park, so if you get a chance to go over there. But their personal home is now going to be open to the public, as long as we have some budget for it, I guess.
Well, wasn't one of his books a woodworking book of Jimmy Carter?
He has written a woodworking book, outdoor books. He wrote one exhaustive novel about the Civil War. I would recommend all of his books, but let's save that one for last. That's right. And his best books, if you're just starting out reading about Jimmy Carter, you want to, I would suggest that last book that I just said, Faith: A Journey for All. It's short. It's great. It gets to encompass all of his wisdom. He also wrote, I think he was in late 80s or 90s when he wrote another full life biography. So I would recommend that one. But of all of his books, I would recommend An Hour Before Daylight. It's one of the best memoirs I've ever read. Now, one of the other best memoirs I've ever read is First Lady of Plains by Rosalind. She was also a great writer. In fact, one time he and I were talking about writing, and he was asking me about my methodology, and she was sitting beside him, and finally she just broke in and said, I write books too. So they were very competitive with one another, and she was a great angler, and they were competitive with that too. Any other observations, questions, thoughts? Well, I appreciate.
Did anybody ever go back to the Alaska politicians and ask what they thought about it?
I doubt it. Ted Stevens was indicted many years later. As it turned out, it was an abuse of the justice system, and those people who invited him ended up being indicted. But a little story about Ted Stevens, as he and Jimmy Carter were trying to work out some sort of agreement, Stevens came to the Oval Office, and Jimmy Carter had maps of Alaska spread out all over the floor. And he was trying to show him how he was balancing all the interests in all the different places. And Stevens continued to get frustrated and finally left. And the press confronted Stevens outside the White House and said, "So are we going to get a deal or not?" And Stevens said, "I don't know. I'm going to have to go back and study because that son knows more about my state than I do." So that's about as much as we ever got, humility as we ever got out of Senator Stevens on the issue. Well, I appreciate y'all having me. I appreciate your interest and your support of 100 Miles.
And I had a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Obviously, a lot of the things that Carter did, he was ahead of his time. Willing to take, what some may see as political risk, but he saw as, needed to be done. But I was wondering, what do you think his eventual legacy will be, and how is that tied into why you wrote this book?
Well, a couple of things that I learned about President Carter through him and through reading about him that I have tried to take on personally and continue to fail at. But one, he said that he tried to learn something new every day of his life. And he lived 100 years, So the other one is more personal about his faith. When he lost his first gubernatorial run, he didn't know what he was going to do with himself, and he had the farm, but he self-confessed he did not feel close to God, and he didn't understand where he stood with his faith. And he was a man of faith. He taught Sunday school and all these things. So he He signed up to go on a door-to-door missionary run in New England, and so here's this peanut farmer from New England. Nobody knows him. He ran for governor of Georgia and failed. Nobody would know that. He gets paired up with a Cuban American named Elroy Cruz, and Cruz was really good at going into homes, talking to people, and sharing his faith. And Carter wasn't. He said, he finally took him aside and said, how do you do it? I can't do it. I just listen to you, and I feel so like inept. And Cruz told him something that he took with him for the rest of his life, which was, he said, I always have two loves in my heart. One is for God, and one is for whoever happens to be in front of me at that very moment. And so I've also tried to take that one on. I fail at it miserably all the time. But, those lessons, those personal lessons, and these ideas that you can find a discrete problem that's solvable and then solve it, I think those are the things that inspire me the most about President Carter. We wrote the book really because there were all these stories. The way the book came about, in 2020, they could not go back to Spruce Creek because of the pandemic. So Dr. Hicks, Carlton Hicks, do any of you guys know him? He was the eye doctor here forever. He just retired last year. Yeah, sold his practice. He's 86, something like that. But he and Carter were close friends. He campaigned for Carter, suspended his practice, in the 70s to campaign for Carter. Hicks went on he and a group of students from HBCUs traveled into Mississippi to stump for Carter, and that was only just a few years, about 10 years after the three activists had been murdered there. So Hicks really went out all in for Carter early, and they were friends ever since. He went on every one of these trips. So Dr. Hicks called me and said, the Carters can't go, we're going anyway in May. And we loaded up, and Dr. Hicks always drives everywhere, so it was just like the camper van. He said, meet me at my office at 4:30 in the morning, bring a box, he is very meticulous, bring a box of Grandy's sweet rolls. I'm going to eat one when we start the trip, and at 10 o'clock I'm going to eat the other one. He maps out all of we're going to get our gas at this Love's. We got our masks. We're going to do this whole thing. So we did it. My dad and I and another friend of ours, Tom Sayer, we all went up there and we fished Spruce Creek. And he told all these stories. Hicks was telling all these stories. And the owner of the dairy farm, who's also been on all these trips, was telling stories. And at one point, Dr. Hicks pulls out a beautiful bamboo fishing rod, and inscribed on it, it says James Earl Carter. And he had been up at Plains a few weeks before, and Carter had given him that fishing rod because he knew he was never going to fish again. And then he pulled out a box of flies, and it was a beat up, worn up box, and it was the president's fly box with flies that he had hand tied himself. His favorite fly was the black ant. So we all took turns catching fish with President Carter's flies with his rod, and then we sent him pictures of the fish. And it was at that moment we said, okay, these stories are going to be lost if we don't write them. So Dr. Hicks and I started working on it and eventually wrote the book. So it's much more organic than, I learned more about him through the process of writing the book rather than writing the book because I was an authority on him or anything like that.
I commend you because we always hear the publicized Carter or the reaction to it. We don't get, this is rare that you can get this level of story, so thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a personal insight into who he was. And he was a neat guy. He was very, very thrifty. He had to save up for all these trips. It would just, it's not like you think a president gets to go wherever they want. He would sometimes say, I can't afford to go on that trip. We need to do something else. He flew commercially most of the time. The four main groups, people that went on the trips was Hicks, the eye doctor, a dock builder from North Carolina that he met through Habitat for Humanity, a billionaire who eventually decided, and it's in the book, through his discussions with Carter, to give his entire fortune away. And Carter, the president. So they went on all these trips together, and they had to save up for them, as I said. Carter never took a penny for a speech. He never took any money for being president. He lived off of his book royalties and his government pension from being a sailor and from being the president, and he lived off of his farm. That was it. He shopped at Walmart for all of his clothes. I mean, he did. You can look at pictures and you can tell he's got his Dickies on. And he and Rosalind got in some pretty bitter fights about that because she said, Walmart, it marginalizes communities. They don't pay their people. All of they don't provide. And so she had some pretty good arguments. And I think he lost the better side of that. But his response was, well, only rich people can look down their noses at people for shopping at Walmart. And Walmart provides goods to people in communities that might not otherwise have them. He had his reason, his belief about Walmart too. So they had to agree to disagree. I'm a native of St. Simons. I live right here. Yes, ma'am. And so these are my people right here, my wife and son. So thanks for having us.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to hear
Thanks.
those insights and all those things. So I absolutely think it's perfect that you're all here tonight to learn how to use the imagery day.
That's right.
So take that as our final message. Thank you all for watching online. Thank you for supporting 100 Miles. And again, thank you to all of our sponsors. Have a good night.